We're going to focus on the recent history of two Middle Eastern countries, Egypt and Algeria. Egypt and Algeria have gained their independence from colonial or semi-colonial domination since World War II, Egypt from the British and Algeria from the French. We'll look at some of the stages on the journey toward self-rule of these two Arab states over the last 40 years or so. We'll start with Egypt. Egypt is part of North Africa. It's bordered on the west by Libya, on the south by the Sudan, and it also includes most of the Sinai Desert, which is flanked by Israel and Saudi Arabia. About a third of all Arabs live in Egypt, which has a population of more than 46 million people. 90% of the Egyptians are Muslims. Most of the remaining 10% are Coptic Christians. We'll now hear firsthand from an expert from Egypt what she feels are the most important events that have shaped modern Egypt since the end of the Second World War. Dr. Jacqueline Laka.
Now, if I have to look at the most important events of Egypt since 1940, at the end of World War II, and I have to choose, I would say, the three most important dates, I would choose 52, 56, and 67. I would like to look at these events from three planes. First, the purely Egyptian political, social situation. Then the regional setting, which is the Arab setting, as well as the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is enmeshed in the region. And thirdly, I would look at the international plane, the outside superpowers who are interested in the region and have an impact on the region. Even though these planes might look separated, they interact with each other, and you have this interdependence of factors. Okay, 52 was the coup d'etat in Egypt, which was engineered by a group of Egyptian officers. They ousted King Farouk of Egypt in a rather easy coup d'etat, I would say. It was bloodless, it was quick. It was a group of Egyptian officers who had certain griefs against the regime. The first grief on the purely Egyptian level would be the fact of social inequity, specifically in land distribution. Egypt's cultivable land is about 5% of the whole total Egyptian area. This is a very small percentage. The majority of the Egyptian peasants at the time were landless, and the majority of the land was owned by a small percentage, the royal family and the upper class. On the regional level, there was another grief on the part of these officers, the defeat, the Egyptian defeat in 48 vis-à-vis Israel. They put the blame on the regime, on the poor equipment they had, the poor training they had, as well on the outside power, Britain, who was still influencing the king and had a foothold in the region. They were in the Suez Canal and were controlling indirectly the Egyptian army. That was 52. By the time we have 56, Gamal Abdel Nasser had emerged as the leader of the officers. The leadership had realized if they wanted to advance the country, just taking the land of the rich landlords was not enough. They would not eventually have the resources simply redistributing the land. So their pet project was the Aswan Dam, the hope that they would electrify the valley, and this needed a lot of capital, which was not available, so they were asking for help from the World Bank and, of course, the Western powers. Britain and the United States had promised to help. After the Egyptians had recognized Communist China and had made their arms deal with Czechoslovakia, the Americans were rather unhappy about extending the loan for the Aswan Dam, and the offer was withdrawn after a number of missteps in negotiations. This infuriated Gamal Abdel Nasser, which nationalized the Suez Canal Company, whose dock was mainly British and French. Now this infuriated the French and the British, and there was a rather secret agreement with Israel that they would try to regain control of the canal, and that is 56. Now 56 had an international angle also, which was the American upset about the British and the French having their operation against Egypt without telling them, also having their agreement with Israel about this operation without telling the Americans. At the time, Secretary of State Foster Dulles was furious about his closest allies going into what looked to the world as gunboat diplomacy without the knowledge of the United States. And we find for one of the rarest times the American and the Russian agreeing in the United Nations about asking both the French and the British to withdraw, as well as Israel, of course, and the creation of the United Nations Emergency Force in the region. I think this attack on Egypt bolstered Nasser's image in the region. It was worked out by the Egyptian press as a tremendous victory for the Egyptian resolve against the colonial powers trying to regain their foothold in Egypt. As you might know, in 54, the last British soldier had left Egyptian territory. And now they were trying to regain this foothold, and the Egyptians had been victorious against this attempt. They regained the Sinai they had lost in that war with Israel. So 56 built up Nasser as the Arab leader, and the Arab unity movement started to build up from that time on. The building up of the Arab identity of the Egyptian people might have started more in earnest at the time. Remember that in 58 you have the United Arab Republic being formed, the Union of Egypt and Syria, which didn't last long, just 2 years, and it broke up. This was the start of the Arab unity movement, because Nasser had this idea that the Arabs will be able to regain their past glory, but the Arab unity movement was dealt a blow by the breakup of the United Arab Republic, but the idea was still strong in intellectual circles, and Nasser stressed the fact that it was only after the Arabs were able to reunite that the injustice that was done to the Palestinian people could be dealt with. So it was in the background. It was not his first priority. His first priority essentially was Egypt, even though he was stressing the Arab unity theme. He was essentially, first of all, an Egyptian nationalist. And this is why 67 dealt a very heavy blow to Egypt, because he lost the Sinai and could not regain it, could not repeat the 56 scenario with the United Nations stepping in and handing it back to him. I would say this is one of the reasons which led to his early death, because he died rather early in 69. And he left a very heavy legacy to Sadat. Sadat followed Nasser, having to free Egyptian land. That was his first priority, regaining the Sinai. And he followed in Nasser's footsteps in the sense that he was willing to compromise. But Sadat was not taken seriously at the beginning. For 3 years, everybody thought he was ineffective. It was only when he started the 73 war that he was taken seriously. Sadat had to deal again on the 3 planes: the Egyptian plane, very poor economic conditions that the war had left Egypt into. The war effort was draining Egyptian resources. The Aswan Dam was not the bonanza which they were hoping for. And on the international plane, Egypt was in a corner, depending on only one superpower, the Russians, which were installed in Egypt in force and were, according to Sadat, rather arrogant in their help. Now, on the regional situation, the Arabs were giving whatever help they were able to financially. Nothing on the military front. And Israel was not about to give away the Sinai without much more serious commitment on the part of Egypt. This led eventually to the Egyptian-Israeli peace plan, but 73 was one step in that direction. If I have to add, an important event is the assassination of Sadat, because the whole momentum towards some regional reconciliation, not only Egyptian, was gone forever. Even though the Arabs did not want to follow the Sadat bandwagon. They needed much more than Sadat's word to go along with him. That might have been unfortunate for the Arabs, which had most to lose by standing on the sideline, namely the Palestinians, the Jordanians, and now the Lebanese.
Now we'll turn to Algeria. If Egypt had a hard struggle to achieve complete independence from Britain, Algeria had to fight a full-scale war in order to break away from France. First, let's look at where Algeria is. It's right in the middle of North Africa, with Morocco to the west and Tunisia and Libya to the east. The population of Algeria is now about 21 million people, 75% of whom are Arabs and 25% Berbers. 98% of Algerians are Muslims. To find out what an Algerian perceives as the highlights of the history of Algeria since the end of World War II, we'll now hear from an expert from that country, Dr. Marnia Lazreg.
There are about 3 to 4 events that shaped contemporary Algeria, and they could be punctuated by the following dates: 1945, 1954, 1962, and to some degree 1971. 1945 is the end of the Second World War. at the time that the armistice was being declared, the Algerian nationalist movement was hoping that now that fascism was put an end to, possibly colonialism would be put an end to also. There were some rumblings among the Algerians in that direction. The Algerians had been enlisted not only during the Second World War, but also during the First World War, and they had been all along trying to parlay their participation in these wars into some measure of equality, and beyond that, as the Second World War was drawing to a close, a measure of national autonomy. They weren't even talking about the full-fledged independence yet, although there was a minority, there was one party who had advocated independence as early as the 1930s. So in 1945, May 1945, there was a demonstration which was called in the city of Sétif in eastern Algeria, in the high plateaus. Algerians walked out into the streets, unfurled Algerian flags, and asked for freedom, independence. There were a few Frenchmen, I think, who were killed. And of course, the reaction on the part of the colonial government was quite severe and devastating. According to the Algerian statistics, 45,000 people died. The French used planes to bombard a number of villages around the area of Sétif and another city, Guelma. It was a very tough response to this desire on the part of the Algerians to be independent, to be free. Well, the events that took place in 1945 simply convinced the Algerian nationalists that they had to find a new formula for fighting the French. That formula was found in 1954, which was really the armed struggle. Hence, really, the revolution started on November 1st, 1954, when throughout the nation, from east to west, the armed struggle started. Police targets, economic targets were hit. Pamphlets were passed around telling the Algerian people and the colonial authorities that now the Algerian nationalist movement has passed on to a new stage of its development, and they were requesting independence, pure and simple. The next date that's very important for contemporary Algeria is obviously 1962, which is really the 3rd of July 1962, when Algerian independence from France was declared. And this was really a momentous development in the history of Algeria. Algeria had been colonized in 1830 by the French. And see, the pivotal point of the French policy in Algeria was to sever the country from the Middle East and also from its immediate neighbors to the west, Morocco, and Tunisia to the east. For example, only a few people were permitted to go to Mecca, and even they had to undergo a very extensive police investigation. Why? Because in Mecca you might meet the other Arabs and exchange ideas with them, and you might rediscover your past, keep alive the idea of nationalism and struggle against the French, so forth and so on. So throughout the colonial period, the French have tried to undermine Islam as a religion. And throughout the 19th century, you could not become a French citizen unless you gave up your religion. Naturalization was not given to any Algerian. Second, Arabic became another target. Very few were the schools where Arabic was taught from the elementary level all the way up. So that by 1954, Algerians were given up for lost by the Middle East. Here they were, they couldn't even speak the kind of Arabic that the other people spoke in the Middle East. We mixed French words with Arabic words, and so we evolved a kind of a dialect. Ben Bella, the first president of Algeria, when he went to Cairo to address an assembly of Arab leaders, antagonized many people because he couldn't speak Arabic. He had to address them in French. So you can imagine the kinds of problems that the French colonization of Algeria has created in terms of perceptions of self, in terms of the cultural integrity of that society. Finally, the 1971 is another crucial date. It's the date when the second Algerian government, headed by President Boumediene, nationalized all the foreign oil concerns in Algeria and demanded, along with Libya, a better rate of purchase of their oil. Politically, I think if you look at the foreign policy of Algeria, it's one of the most consistent. From the very beginning, Algeria has defined its policy as non-aligned. It's neither in the Eastern Bloc camp nor in the Western Bloc camp. It tries to juggle the two and maintain a more or less independent position. It supports all movements of for self-determination, for freedom. And this, of course, can be understood only in historical terms. Algeria, having suffered from colonialism, having fought it for so long, could not possibly support a country that would that would colonize another nation or would try to intimidate that nation.
Much of what we've heard about Egypt's and Algeria's struggles for independence could, of course, have been said about many other countries in the Middle East. The region as a whole has only fairly recently emerged from domination by the Western world. In fact, most of the Gulf states only obtained their independence in the early 70s. But now, every country in the Middle East is independent of the West, politically at least. Whether the Middle Easterners are culturally independent of the Western world is another matter altogether.
TVO. The following program contains explicit descriptions and pictures of torture. Viewer discretion is advised.
Saddam Hussein's Iraq, it's declared policy for enemies of the state to be tortured and executed. And who are the state's enemies? Jews, Christians, Kurds, Shiite Muslims, anyone who's not a loyal follower of Hussein's Ba'ath Party. But even party members and friends of Hussein can suddenly be branded enemies. A behind-the-scenes look at Iraq's enemies of the state, tonight on Human Edge. Hello, I'm Mary Lou Finley. No part of the world has been more on edge this fall than the Middle East. Iraq's August 2nd invasion of Kuwait threw the Arab world into turmoil and has brought all of us to the brink of war. The invasion, which met with worldwide condemnation and with a rare consensus in the United Nations Security Council, has got many people wondering, how could this happen? At a time when the end of the Cold War seemed to promise a new era of peace and cooperation, How did we get to such a state in the Middle East? Some people will answer it's because we failed to resolve the Palestinian issue. Others, because the United States failed to make it clear to Iraqi President Saddam Hussein that an action against Kuwait would not be tolerated. It's a complex question, and no doubt there are complex answers, which I'll be discussing later with Dr. Atif Kubursi of McMaster University. But whatever the reason for the current unrest in the Middle East, the film we're about to see gives us much of the background to the conflict. It's clear that for over a decade, the world has chosen to pretty much ignore the ruthless, bloody nature of Saddam Hussein's regime, and instead has continued to provide dollars and armaments to a ruler who regularly butchers his own people. This film was made for the BBC just before Iraq executed British journalist Farzad Bazoft on spying charges in March of 1990. It's remarkably prescient about the events that have unfolded since. Iraq, Enemies of the State, by journalist Charles Glass, tonight on Human Edge.
أوثقوني كتافا ربطوا لي للسقف خلعوا ثيابي كلها وعذبوني كنت أصرخ نزلوا المكتشي أنا على الأرض فالكهرباء الثانية كنت جسمي مشحون عرفوني شلون؟ كنت مشحون فودوني بعدين سألوني بعض الأسئلة واحد قال لي اعترف أحسن لك قلت له ما عندي شيء رجعني مرة ثانية إذا ضبطوني هناك للورا ربطوا إيدي لورا بالسقف.
He says that he was arrested, so they took him to the torture room. And then they started beating him with the rubber hose and with the sticks and with different kinds. They stripped him of all his clothes and he was tied to the ceiling. And they used electrical devices for nearly half an hour. He was nearly dying. They continued to torture him every day for 4 or 5 days, and he couldn't go even to the WC. And he begged to go, and when he went there, he found himself bleeding blood in the place of the urine.
طلع من الدم بلاد وكذا ودوني بعدين المستشفى.
This man is one of many men, women, and children who say they have been tortured in Iraq. Iraq is a mostly Arab country, about twice the size of Great Britain, at the eastern edge of the Arab world. 15 million people live there. No one can tell you for certain how many of them have been executed there over the last 20 years, how many thousands have been tortured in its prisons, how many have died from poison gas, how many more have disappeared and simply been forgotten. Yet there is evidence to support the view that Iraqis live in a state of terror. This is recorded in yearly reports by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by the United States State Department, and by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. In testimony to human rights groups, survivors tell similar tales of torture in Iraqi prisons, like these. People tied from fans and beaten, their hands burned with electric grills, and worse. If all this evidence is not a fabrication, if the testimony on which it is based is not a succession of lies, then we can draw only one conclusion, the same conclusion drawn by Amnesty International, that Iraq is now, and has been for many years, one of the most thorough human rights violators in the world.
Iraq, the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, a land where civilization was born. It is the site of ancient Babylon, of Nineveh, and of the Chaldees, where God first called Abraham. It is a rich country. Its fertile fields produce an abundance of food, and its culture, the paintings, ceramics, and poetry, leads the Arab world in creativity and beauty. Its oil reserves are the second largest in the world. Its wealth lies also in the diversity of its peoples, Arabs, Kurds, Assyrians, and Turkomans, Christians as well as Muslims, both Shia and Sunni. Iraq's rulers are Arabs, whose religion is Sunni Muslim, a minority that has always governed. Nothing in my many years as a journalist covering the Middle East could prepare me for so much testimony of systematic state brutality among people who treat education, the arts, and science with respect and reverence. The government has made it nearly impossible for anyone to discover what is really going on. Independent investigations are not permitted. An Amnesty International delegation went to Iraq in 1983. It was not allowed to conduct an independent inquiry, and Iraqi officials dismissed Amnesty's allegations as stemming from prejudice against Iraq.
Like so many others, I have had to rely on the testimony of exiles, many of whom are so afraid for their friends and family still in Iraq that they must hide their faces.
An Iraqi exile has written a book, Republic of Fear, that takes a harsh look at modern Iraq. Scholarly critics compare the work to books by refugees from Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. To protect his identity, the author uses the pen name Samir al-Khalil. For his and his family's safety, we have disguised his voice.
This regime has always practiced the principle of collective punishment. In fact, that is inscribed in laws. So you know that if you are in any way, shape, or form identified, it's your family, close or distant, that can be affected. You know that in advance.
What could happen?
Put it this way, what might not happen, I don't know. Anything could happen.
These Iraqis say they are afraid, even in exile, even as they sit peacefully and tell their stories of the land they escaped. We have to remember that they are in Iran, a country still technically at war with Iraq. But we recorded their testimony without either encouragement or assistance from the Iranian authorities. They are speaking to a Palestinian researcher at the Documentation Center for Human Rights in Iraq.
In Karbala security, he was kept for 1 day.
One man tells how he was taken to a security jail after he had been overheard criticizing the government.
They give them some kind of injections in which leave them just like crazy people. Some kind of chairs, and they fix something to his ears. And then he shakes, just like a shock. And then they kick him.
Another man tells how his hands were tied behind his back. He had to stand for hours on one leg, and that when he tried to stand on two legs, he was beaten.
They took off all his clothes. All naked.
علقوني منا بهالشكل مو منا بهالشكل لا منا
they hang.
بلي شو اسمه كهربائي بركي موجود
Yes.
حبل موجود منا
There is a rope in the
بهذا الشكل
and he was
وهذا الايدي بهذا يصير بهالشكل كنا نصيح.
Of course it hurts very much when somebody is hanging from the back from his hand.
نفس الحالة كانوا يستعملون مع إخوة يعني مسجل قضية اسم
And
التلف.
he could hear the barking of a dog, and then they tell him confess. If you don't confess, release the dog. And he wondered why the dog doesn't bite the others. But later he discovered that there was no dog, but it was a recorder machine and the sound of a dog. But there was a kind of device which can bite, which can cut the flesh of the body. It was a kind of torturing machine.
The man tells how he saw other people tortured, including a student from the Shiite holy city of Najaf. When the student would not confess, they brought his son to the prison.
They brought his little boy, his child, and told him if he didn't confess, they would kill his son. And actually they brought an iron, electric iron, and they started burning the child until he died.
Iraq has never been a democracy. Britain ruled the country from 1920 to 1932, but kept its troops on in the early years of independence. Both before and after the country's monarchy was overthrown in 1958, the army staged a series of coups, the last in 1968, which brought an underground Arab nationalist party of soldiers and civilians to power, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party. Since then, that one party has ruled Iraq. Ba'ath in Arabic means rebirth, and the party's goal was to give birth to a new, united Arab nation out of 20 separate Arab states. From 1980 to 1988, Arab Iraq fought its ancient enemy in Persian Iran, using the most modern, sophisticated weapons East and West could supply. The West, although fearing the spread of Iran's religious revolution, sold weapons to both sides. Tens of thousands died. By 1987, the United States sent its warships to protect shipping bound for Iraq. Neither Iran nor Iraq won the war, but when Iran accepted a ceasefire in August of 1988, both countries claimed victory. The man who led Iraq into war is Saddam Hussein, President of the Republic, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council. His picture, his presence, is everywhere. His enemies say he rules the country with an iron fist. In 1981, Saddam Hussein was asked in a BBC interview whether enemies of the state should be tortured and killed.
Yes, it calls for it to be subject to execution and to torture. In accordance with the law, we say he who collaborates with a foreign party is sentenced to death.
President Saddam Hussein has never repudiated his endorsement of torture as state policy. Over the 9 years since he made that statement, human rights organizations have received thousands of accounts of torture, including the torture of young children, and of summary execution, the use of chemical weapons, and mass deportation. We're not in a position to refute claims by some Iraqi diplomats that the more serious abuses came to an end with the 1988 ceasefire. But one thing is clear. The Iraqi government has consistently sought enemies to punish, and to punish severely.
The first victims of the Ba'ath government in 1969 were easy targets, Iraqi Jews accused of spying for Israel. The government hanged these Jews in public in Baghdad. No one protested, and the Ba'ath then executed 44 more people it accused of spying for Iran. More deaths followed, communists, Shiite Muslim clerics, and finally, members of the Ba'ath Party itself. Saddam Hussein held power within the Ba'ath. He was a civilian, but a soldier, General Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, acted as president. Bakr stepped down in 1979. Saddam Hussein succeeded him, and he proceeded to put 22 of his closest associates to death. The trial was in secret, but the public announcement of the killings told all Iraq that Saddam Hussein would tolerate no opposition. Inside modern Iraq, people find ways to survive, ways to avoid the knock on the door in the dead of night, at least until a neighbor or a business rival accuses them of being enemies of the state. Years ago, the Iraqi poet Maruf Arisafi gave this advice to his countrymen. Speak not, O people, for talking is prohibited. Laugh when you suffer injustice. Be merry and never complain. Thank them when they insult you, and smile when they strike your face. Saddam Hussein has his supporters, particularly Arab Sunni Muslims from his home region of Tikrit. Also, many Iraqis pay tribute to what Iraqi propaganda calls his victory over Iran, and to his program to industrialize and modernize Iraq. To the Ba'ath Party, there is only one people, Arab. This idea is consecrated in the writings of Michel Aflaq, a Christian and one of the founders of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party. When Aflaq died in 1989, Saddam Hussein helped to carry the coffin. It was Aflaq who wrote, "The party is the means, and the nation is the end."
Michel Aflaq, the founder of the party in the early 1940s, believed that a true Arab was only one who fervently believed, that is, one's identity and one's beliefs were one and the same thing. Consequently, the only true Arabs around were members of his party. So the more fervent you believed in the principles of Baathism, the more fervently you joined the party and were an active militant and so on, the truer an Arab you actually were. That is, your actual identity as an Arab was more and more real, more and more solid. Anybody who doesn't believe that fervently, who doesn't identify fully and totally with the party, is an outsider, a traitor, a fifth columnist. Be that person a Kurd, because that person believes in their Kurdish identity, or a Shiite, or a Sunni communist, for instance. And no matter whether that person has ancestors that go back hundreds of years, so long as the criterion of loyalty is not there, that person is not even qualified to be a citizen in the state, and therefore is automatically a traitor. Has betrayed his nation.
If he's a traitor?
Well, ultimate sanctions always apply to traitors. You do what every country does to a traitor. You don't treat them as your own citizens, you treat them as people who need to be severely, ruthlessly punished.
Because so many individuals and groups were excluded from full participation in the Ba'athist ideal, no community has been untouched by state violence. The testaments of suffering have come from Muslims, Christians, and suspected political dissidents alike. But no community has lost as many houses, as many villages, as many lives in so many ways as have the Kurds. The Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the Middle East without a state of their own. They live in the mountains of northern Iraq and the surrounding countries. They are not Arabs. They have their own distinct history, language, and culture. Although Iraq's constitution grants them more rights than any other country, the Kurds have fought again and again for autonomy in Iraqi Kurdistan. And the government has fought back. A modern military with the most advanced weapons against guerrillas and peasants. One Kurdish mother tells how the war affected her and her young son. When the Iraqis released them from prison, she brought the boy to live in Europe.
مناڵ جەرگی خۆتە لەو کات و تەنگان و نەخۆشیە مناڵەکە لێ شارنەوانێ ئەنێ مدلوانێ بیکوژن ینی تر نەبینمانە لەو کاتانێک کە گیرابوون ئەو چەند ڕۆژانەی یەکەم کە من هەر قسەم ناکرد و یان گوە بێ قسە بکەیت و شتە زانی تو بە ئیشاتیتە تەوانێ ئیتر زریانیان لە من سەن و منیان کردە دەروان لای خۆیاندانەوە کە ئەمی زۆرە گرا و ئەی زۆران پاش ئەوە جگەریان لەسەر قاچی کوژان بۆوانە کە قاچی برینار ببوو.
Her husband, Mustafa Mahmoud, was a guerrilla commander, a member of the Peshmerga, Kurdish for those who face death. In 1987, he and 9 other Kurds in the village of Marga found that the yogurt they had eaten was laced with thallium, a common poison for killing rats. 3 people died and the rest suffered severe after effects.
شو بسر هاد من ورده وضعي خوم هلاقة بمسري بنجكانم هموي سربو سري بنجي قاشم هموي سربو هستمكر بيتاقد بم قوتم نبو دايكم بدمان بوسر قبران بينيجي نمتواني بش مجر ترمي دايكم ولا بلوي ك وضعي قوتم تيانا ما وإنسان نتواني بش تجير ترمي دايكي ومعنى وضعي هلاكة شكم كروتم من أمدر ما خوارد كراوين.
Mustafa Mahmoud was taken to Iran, and from there to London, where he received treatment, and doctors confirmed he had been poisoned with thallium. Many Kurds, like Mustafa, were fighters in a war against the government. Others were not. This is the Iraqi Kurdish village of Halabja, attacked with poison gas by the Iraqi army in March of 1988. At first, Iraq denied the use of chemicals, but later excused the action as an attack on Iranian forces. The same could not be said of chemical weapons attacks elsewhere in Kurdistan that witnesses say have taken place since the ceasefire. Thousands of people died, people who could not fight back, who could not run away. who could not protect their children with their own bodies. The attacks were part of government policy to destroy Kurdish resistance. Resistance Iraq says is inspired by its foreign enemies. In 1983, 8,000 Kurdish men of the Barzani clan were removed from a resettlement camp in Kurdistan and have not been seen by their families since then. The Iraqis have removed thousands of Kurds from the border areas near Iran and from the oil fields near the town of Kirkuk. After attacks by Iraqi forces, sometimes using chemical weapons, journalists who have been in northern Iraq in the last year report the Kurdish countryside is nearly uninhabited. Not only Kurds, but Arab Shiite Muslims have suffered. During the war with Iran, the loyalty of many Shiites came into question, and some were seen as fifth columnists sympathetic to their fellow Shiites in Iran. Thousands were sent into exile. One Shiite family suffered from the application of Iraqi laws permitting collective punishment. 130 people, including 12 children, were imprisoned, not for having committed a crime, but because one member of the family went to Iran to lead an armed opposition movement. Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim is a Shiite Muslim religious leader who directs the largest Iraqi Shiite underground organization from a capital that is at war with Iraq. Any government would regard him as a traitor. But in Iraq, the charge of treason has been leveled against his entire family. A cousin, Sahib al-Hakim, is chairman of the London-based Organization of Human Rights in Iraq. He claims his family is held hostage and that the Iraqis warned Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim to end his campaign against the government.
When the warning was ignored, the Iraqi regime executed 6 members of my family and sent Mr. Mohammed Hussein al-Hakim, who witnessed the execution in Iraq, and he came to Tehran and told Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim, please stop your activity unless more executions will occur. Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim again refused the warning. The Iraqi regime executed another 10 members of my family. And Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim also ignored this warning, and he continued his struggle against the Iraqi regime. And more executions have happened in Iraq.
Dr. al-Hakim, do you feel that you are taking a personal risk through your activities, and do you feel that it's possible you're risking the lives of your other family members who are still in prison in Iraq?
Yes, my activities may threaten the lives of my family al-Hakim, and I have been threatened to be killed many times by Iraqi agents here in London and in Europe. But I have no choice. I have to continue my activities because I think all the Iraqi people are innocent, and all of them are hostages, and they are living in the big prison which is called Iraq.
Is it possible that a country can seem to its own people like a prison? The United Nations estimates that more than 650,000 Iraqis are refugees in neighboring countries, from which, despite appalling conditions and a lack of many freedoms, they refuse to return to Iraq under its present government. Many of the refugees in Iran, where their lives are restricted, discuss what they left behind and the reasons they are not ready to return. This man says Iraqi police arrested him and his 2 brothers at a demonstration in Baghdad in the early years of the war. He is saying his brothers were executed. He tells the Palestinian volunteer with the Iraqi Human Rights Organization in Iran that his interrogators put a blindfold on him and tied his hands behind his back, then hung him by his arms from the ceiling. He says they put an electrode in his ear and another to his penis, then turned on the electricity. He claims they used an electric probe, which they called an artificial penis, on both men and women. Afterwards, he tells the woman, they hit the soles of his feet with rubber hoses between 200 and 300 times. A Shiite former major in the Iraqi army relates the tale of what happened to him when he refused to join the Ba'ath Party. He said the government arrested him along with 6 of his 7 sons and that he was tortured. When they released him to bring in his 7th son, he found security police already at his home putting the boy under arrest. He escaped to Iran, he says, and there he learned his sons had been executed. He says other prisoners had their hands tied down, with needles like paper clips inserted under their fingernails and heated with a flame. Refuge in Iran for many Iraqis is harsh, with restrictions on their movements and no guarantee of permanent housing. As well as the Kurds and Shiites who have fled, there are Christians, descendants of Iraq's ages-old Assyrian community. Thousands of Assyrian Christians have made their way to Europe and the United States, but many remain in Iran where they are free to worship. These Assyrians insist that back home in Iraq, the government will not allow them to teach their Assyrian language or to preserve their culture.
في الدقيقة سبب أنا إنه منتمي إلى الحركة الديمقراطية العشورية الطلبة وحقوق يعني والأفرايد فرح مخاثة برقة مخاثة بتفنكة أنا مخاثة الأقلة محاربة نفسية
خيتة ديانتي هذا الحكومة عراقية محاربة وأمرانا كلها مقابطلة لشاوقة قاشاني دوري وقات أمرودي وصبويات طاليني وبخرطة خراي بحجتة أكراد وذل حجوم مثواثين ترمى مثواثة زودة كلها بشلا مقضي وبشلا طريلي
في لفاشة بين قرداية والجيش العراقي فأخنا المزروعات دي انخشلوا وقدلوا بيتنانا قدلوا داية قريب.
The violence has not spared children of whatever ethnic or religious community. Children have fled the country. They have been imprisoned. Amnesty International and other human rights groups have amassed a body of evidence to conclude that many children have been tortured and killed. The human rights groups have protested to the Iraqi government, which denied the charges. But the evidence forces one to ask, are all these people lying, or are there simply no limits to the violence? In his poem, The Thinker, the Iraqi poet Salah Niazi wrote, "In which primeval philosophy did violence and bloodshed have their seed? Like mire in our ancestral loins, violence is our lot, our heritage. And from the earliest dawn of time, the faces of children keep disappearing." In London, I confronted the Iraqi ambassador with the reports by all the human rights organizations and by the U.S. State Department.
Allegations of violations of human rights in Iraq are baseless. Allegations of use of chemical weapons against the Kurds are baseless. No evidence can be shown or presented by you other than these sources. You have to examine them.
Do you think that all of these individuals, many of whom we have interviewed ourselves, and all of these organizations then, including the United States State Department and the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, are simply lying?
Well, as you know, in every country there are individuals who betray their nation. So you can judge from this fact the allegations you have raised to me.
So that you're saying simply that all of the people who are making these allegations are traitors?
But who are they? I haven't seen them. Let me meet them.
The Iraqi writer Samir al-Khalil says that he and others conceal their identities because they fear the violence of the Iraqi state against themselves and their families. He believes this violence has produced a climate of fear that affects the entire country.
The levels of violence that have been reached, the types, the forms, the numbers of armed men, the number of people implicated, the number of people who had to report on other people, who had to commit acts that they don't want others to know of, who had to, in order to get a favor or get on in life, just simply improve their chances in a particular position or job in government or something. Those types of things, those types of involvement of very, very large numbers of people in acts that have sundered their links with other citizens and made them afraid of even their fellow citizens. A polity like Iraq is held together by the fact that citizens are afraid of each other, not so much afraid of the regime, they're afraid of each other.
In the safety of her new home in Britain, a young Iraqi girl remembers that in Baghdad, whenever a schoolmate's father would disappear, she and her friends were afraid even to speak about it. Then one night, security police knocked on her family's door.
The girls and I never used to talk about it. They only like with their brothers and sisters. But, sometimes my mum used to talk with my auntie about, how they take people away. They used to do that so then people won't know that they're taking people away. They used to come in the middle of the night so nobody would notice.
And then no one would talk about it? And then no one would talk about it?
No.
Why not?
Because they were still scared because next day might come after them.
So on the night that they came for your family, you had already known many families that this had happened to?
Yeah, but I never knew our family really. It was a very big surprise for me. They would do it for come after us as well.
Security police came to her home at night and arrested her father. They also took her, her sister, and her mother to prison. Months later, the mother and children, not the father, were released and deported to Iran.
Have you seen your husband since that day?
أنا ما شفت زوجي من يوم اللي تفارقنا ولحد الآن ماكو لا رسائل منه ولا أي خبر. طبعا حتى الأهل أو الأقارب الموجودين بالعراق ما يقدرون يروحون يسألون عنه لأن أي واحد يروح يسأل يحجزوه وياه فلهذا ما يقدرون يحجزون يسألون عن أي واحد كان.
What do you think has happened to him? Where do you think he is now?
عن المعاملة اللي عاملون إياها ما أتوقع مثلا مرت له واحد يشوف الله لأنهم على أقل شيء يعذبونه يقتلون بيهم فما يديرون باله.
Iraqis who have worked for the government told us that most people know what the security services are doing, secret arrests, torture, and executions. They discussed on film with us the reasons they dared not criticize the government inside Iraq. Now, after the execution of Farzad Bazoft, they called us and asked us to edit them out of the film because they were afraid for themselves and their families, even in Europe. They had told us in interviews on film that Ba'ath Party members and government officials were implicated in what they called the government's crimes, fellow accomplices sharing responsibility. What is more, they said, they could not leave the Ba'ath Party to join another party, because if they did, the penalty was death. If there were a radical change in Iraq, and there should by some miracle be some equivalent of Nuremberg trials, would anyone be able to plead in his defense that he didn't know what was going on?
I think not. I think one has to deal with reality, Iraqi reality, on the basis that it's something like a huge concentration camp in which the inmates are obliged to do things that they would not otherwise have done, but nonetheless, by doing them, have put themselves in a position of some kind of responsibility for what was finally happening. And in the end, you cannot simply stand back and say, I didn't know, I wasn't part of it. Every Iraqi in one way or another was complicit.
Saddam Hussein has recently announced that he wants a peace treaty with Iran, that he plans to legalize parties other than the Ba'ath, to hold free elections, and to draft a new constitution. Meanwhile, his military is the strongest combat-ready force in the Arab world. He recently put on display the new Al-Hussein rocket that could carry conventional, chemical, or even nuclear warheads to Iran, to the Soviet Union and to Israel.
Now, does the world outside the immediate region need to be concerned about Iraq? I mean, should we be concerned that its military technology is improving? It has a homegrown military industry. It's developing nuclear, biological, chemical weapons.
Yes, I think we should be extremely concerned.
Why?
Because I haven't a shadow of a doubt that if they had, for instance, a nuclear bomb or massive chemical, biological weapon capability, they would use it.
Iraq has had significant international help. When Iraq put this rocket into space in 1989, American-made computers were in the control room. West German equipment was utilized. Austrian engineers gave advice. The rocket itself was adapted from a Soviet design, and there are persistent reports that China is aiding Iraq's nuclear program.
No government has moved to isolate Iraq for its development and use of chemical weapons, for its development of germ warfare, for its attempt to acquire a nuclear bomb, and least of all, for its human rights record. On the contrary, the Soviet Union, China, and most NATO countries are helping with loans, equipment, and technical expertise. Is it simply that no one knows what's going on, that no one can hear the pleas of the victims of torture and of chemical warfare, people whose testimony lies unread in these many reports? After a trip to the Iraqi border with Syria and discussions with Iraqi exiles and American officials, I filed this report on American television in December 1989.
Despite the weight of evidence, the United States has become Iraq's largest trading partner, and the Bush administration continues financial support to the Iraqi government by guaranteeing $1 billion in yearly agricultural loans. Congress has shown some concern. It recently cut a smaller program of government-sponsored bank credits. Now, informed sources have told ABC News the Bush administration is considering a special waiver to resume bank credits to Iraq, despite Congress and despite the human rights charges against the Iraqi government. Charles Glass, ABC News, Washington.
We have tried, by the way, but the State Department refuses to answer our questions about resuming bank credits to Iraq. In other news, there's been a...
1 month later, without any announcement, the Bush administration decided to override Congress and guarantee loans of $250 million to Iraq. There is no public outcry. Meanwhile, hundreds of companies in the United States, in Great Britain, in West Germany, are competing to sell to the Iraqi government the technology...
Welcome to TVO Home Studies. Next, we present Keys to Weight Training for Men and Women, a 3-part series that will teach you how to develop your own weight training program. The series is for men and women and is ideal for beginners and those who are already exercising with weights. If you'd like help with a weight training program, you can order the unedited 80-minute VHS video cassette of the series. You'll also receive a 20-page workout handbook, which features the same exercises presented in the video. Also included are 2 exercise log sheets to record your progress. At the end of the program, we'll tell you how to order the video cassette.
Think how much easier and more enjoyable your life could be with a body that's strong, flexible, and graceful, so that every movement, from the smallest to the most strenuous, is something to delight in. That kind of life can be yours when you condition your body with weights. Think of it as weight training for better living.
We want these workouts to be pain-free and injury-free. So if any of these concerns apply to you, I strongly suggest you consult a doctor before jumping into any exercise program.